This series is called The Return, a quasi-view of the coming kingdom of Christ on earth based on biblical facts. Chapter 7, Memoirs of a Warrior Angel. Today is a perfect day, as always, and you got up early to walk your pet, and by the way, the Lord has allowed some cool pets to be imported to earth, an assortment of different species, like the pet you now have, that looks a lot like a dog but has more of the temperament of a gentle cat. And there's this one really cool animal that's also similar to a dog but has natural rainbow colors on it that is 10 times more loyal, and some say that it seems to be able to know exactly what you want it to do before you say it. Life in the new millennium is great and truly exceeds everyone's expectations. There's one thing for sure though, as an immortal, you always must remind yourself not to think your way back home when you're out walking your pet, seeing as how you once left him stranded by doing that, although you quickly recovered him. Every day is like a new adventure, and there's not a day that goes by that someone you know doesn't knock on your door, bearing very fine gifts, just to see how you're doing. You'll never forget the last time your former wife came to visit accompanied by your children and some of your grandchildren. As an immortal, the feelings you now have for each other are classified much differently. Although you notice each other's beauty, there's no physical attraction, but you still have certain wonderful memories of sharing your last life together, especially the ones that involve the love of Christ. As the day goes into the evening, you decide to contact the warrior angel you met, until you realize that you never got his name, so you send a mental message to Gamaliel asking him if he could drop by. He tells you he just got done with his daily duties, and asks if now a good time would be. No sooner than you say sure, you turn around and he's standing right beside you. You want to offer him a seat, and ask him if he thinks your sofa would be strong enough to hold his weight. He then tells you not to worry, because he can adjust his weight when he sits on it. After preparing him some coffee, you take a seat and are almost embarrassed to tell him that because of all your anticipation of seeing the cosmos during your last visit, you didn't get the name of his friend, the warrior angel. He somehow knows what it is that you want to convey, and before you speak, he tells you that you never got his name because he didn't mention it when you were introduced, and goes on to tell you that the angel you met was Michael the Archangel, which explained his warrior-like demeanor. You say, "Wow, so that was Michael?" Gamaliel then explains to you that Michael has always been like that, so unassuming in his behavior that the only way he is noticed is by his appearance, and how he never introduces himself as Michael the Archangel. Up until this point, you couldn't wait to hear some angelic war stories, but now that you know it was Michael that you met, your anticipation just shot through the roof. Gamaliel then sends a mental message to Michael and asked him to join you if he could, and Michael then appears right there in your living room. You ask Michael to please take a seat, and you scurry into the kitchen to get him some coffee. While you're in there you notice that you have nothing to offer them to go with the coffee except some Krispy Kreme donuts that you got earlier that morning, so you bring them out and ask them to try them with their coffee. Gamaliel looks at you and smiles, then tells you that he has long since tried the donuts while appearing to you once as a perfect stranger during the last age. You don't remember the time, but he tells you not to worry because you treated him very well. Michael eats one, then says how they somewhat remind him of the fresh bread and honey that was prepared daily in heaven. He likes them so much that he helps himself to another. The conversation finally rolls around to where Michael begins to tell a story of a particular battle in the second heaven that you are very familiar with. It's the story of how Gabriel had to call on him for help while delivering answers to Daniel's prayers. There are certain details that Michael is not allowed to offer, but tells you how there was never a time when Satan and his followers would ever acknowledge what the Lord did in regard to his sacrifice for all the cosmos. Michael describes how the Lord's sacrifice is seen in heaven, appearing as a great ball of fire that sits right next to the throne of the Father, and shines throughout all of heaven. He also tells you that when a person, Christian or otherwise, would confess their sins to God, how their sins would come up before God, and by their confession, would get totally engulfed into that great ball of fire, never to be remembered. He also tells you, metaphorically speaking, that there is also a cup before the Father, and how all the unconfessed sins go into that cup, and how after the cup became full, was when the end of the last age began. Michael describes how the second heaven is divided from the earth contained under a huge ark, and the ark had a dividing horizontal line in the middle of it. On the bottom portion, below the line, is where the earth is, with all its people, trees, water, and the things you see on earth, but in the upper portion of the line, is where the second heaven is, and this is where all the fighting would take place. He said the fighting would get so fierce that it would sometimes cause oddities to occur on earth in the form of what people would think are natural phenomena like thunder and lightning. He then laughed as he recited something that people used to say on earth, how when it thunders and lightning that the devil is beating his wife. He goes on to say, that wasn't because the devil was beating his wife, but many times because we were beating on the devil. He explains how Satan is totally incorrigible, and how he knew that he could never win, but that his pride wouldn't let him concede. At that point, you asked Michael why then did Gabriel need his help, and he said because Gabriel, at the time was being threatened by another fallen archangel, that there were also archangels that fell, and only an archangel is a match to fight another archangel. He went on to explain how there are other good archangels of whom he is the chief, but since he is the guardian of Israel, which Daniel was a part of, he was the only archangel assigned to help at that moment. He also said that sometimes the fighting would get so intense, that God the Father would rise and get involved, and when that happened, it would send all the fallen angels running for cover like scared insects. He described how the constant crashing thunder and lightning would come down out of the third heaven like rain, with God's wrath in full swing. How God would speak through the thunder and lightning, and when that happened, the fallen angels, including Satan, knew the Father was very, very angry. Michael summarized his story by saying that the Father is super serious when it comes to Satan tampering with any of his created beings, and is especially protective over those who confesses his beloved Son. Michael had so many more stories to tell, but he and Gamaliel were both pressed for time, so they had to leave. Shortly thereafter, you received a mental message from your mom, asking if she could come over, and you tell her to please come. Your mom is the one who led you to Christ, and for as long as you could remember, she always prayed for you, especially during the rebellious years of your last life when you didn't want anything to do with Christ. Your mom was greatly rewarded for her faithfulness to pray for you, and everywhere she goes, she is heralded for it. In fact, the only ones who are heralded among the immortals are the ones who were very faithful in doing what seemed like the most insignificant things. You want her to sit and talk, but as always, the first thing she wants to do is get in the kitchen and prepare your favorite foods. You think to yourself how some things about moms will never change, and how you both now look so young that you look like you could be her brother. During the last age, your mom died when you were in your early 40s, and she always talks about how even in heaven she would pray for you, and how she was one of those in that great cloud of witnesses. Your mom still loves to cook, and the great thing about it is, as an immortal, they can cook chef-style meals without using a recipe. The knowledge just comes to them, and the meals are superb. You and your mom begin to talk about the upcoming Feast of Tabernacles that will start in a few weeks that's held each year in Jerusalem. She can't make up her mind as to what kind of dish she's going to prepare for the feast. Each family on earth can bring a certain dish if they want, and no one shows up without bringing a gift for the king. You and your mom live in the same sub-kingdom, and like all the sub-kingdoms, your kingdom is ruled by a servant king. Your king is a man who lived on earth during the 2nd century in the last age, in the area formerly known as Botswana. He's a dark-skinned man who gave his life to Christ after a missionary came to evangelize his village. Everyone in the kingdom calls him King Titus, not because that's his real name, but because he stands a little under 7 feet tall. His story goes that one day during a village church gathering, men from a neighboring tribe came into the village and killed many of the Christians, including the missionary, but instead of running as so many did, Titus stood in faith, and single-handedly subdued 30 of the men. A few he killed out of self-defense, but most of them he was able to restrain, sat them down, and told them about the love of Jesus while using his own blood as an illustration. That resulted in the men shedding many tears as they all repented of their sins. Subsequently, all those men served Jesus in that village for the rest of their lives, as Titus took on the responsibility of the former missionary to lead them. However, as an elderly man, Titus was later killed in another raid while ministering to the people. Each year just before the annual feasts, there's always great anticipation in the hearts of the people, and each sub-kingdom has its own flair of pageantry as they arrive before the presence of the King of Kings. Please subscribe, and click on the bell to be notified for Chapter 8, called The King's Protocol.